Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, coming to you with the first of lecture videos on the topic of memory. Okay, so let's start off then by first looking at the definition of memory. Memory is the ability to store and retrieve information. That's quite simple, but covers it quite well. So I want you to, as we're going through this chapter, I want you to remember a couple things. Please don't write them down. Please just try to remember them. Uh, Things I want you to remember are this sentence: the angry rioter threw a rock at the window. And I want you to remember these items: typewriter, void, cigarette, inherent, fire, and process. Okay, so we can then look at the process of memory as a three-step process. First, we have the process of encoding. This is getting information into a form that our nervous system can work with. In the case of our nervous system, that form is neural impulses. That then is followed by the storage process. The process of storage involves then in our nervous system the formation of neural networks which store the memory. The third part of the process then is retrieval, and that is activating the proper neural network in order to retrieve the information that has been stored. Notice this is a sequential process. In other words, it has to happen in that order for it to occur. So next we look at the types of information storage that have been identified. So this information processing model that was written about by Atkinson-Schiffrin in 1968 still serves us very well. And what they identified at that point in time is still essentially how we believe the memory system is set up. So they identified that there is, first of all, sensory memory. And looking at our diagram here, you have external events that are occurring, and our sensory systems then detect various stimuli in our environment that are related to those external events. And this first then enters sensory memory, or sometimes called sensory register, because sensory memory registers that incoming information for just a fleeting brief moment. Now, that said, it registers a huge amount of information, and that information then, if it is to then be available to us later, must be moved into the next bin of storage, which would be short-term memory. So if it is encoded into short-term memory, what we have is the most important information, that which is most striking to us or that might be most useful in the future, can be moved into short-term memory. Notice that there is far less information entering short-term memory here. It's whittled down to what's most important to us. That information, in turn, can only stay there a short period of time, very short, as we'll learn, longer than sensory memory, but not long enough for us to really have it much later. So if we need to remember that information long term, then it is encoded into long-term memory. However, what we will learn is that only a small portion of that which was in short-term memory actually will end up being encoded into long-term memory. So if you notice, from the vast amount of information in sensory memory, we have a fragment of it, making it into short-term memory, and even a smaller fragment in this case, maybe just that weird guy that was in the crowd that maybe it'd be good to remember that guy's face in case you run across him later in a dark alley or something like that, right? So notice there is less and less information as we go longer and longer term. Now, information that is stored in long-term memory then can potentially be retrieved back into short-term, or what we now call working memory, in order for use later. Okay, so that's the process. Now, some information is encoded automatically without effort on our part. For example, spatial cues, where something was located. Often we don't have to think about that. For example, maybe you're taking a test and that term that you're trying to remember, you can remember where it was in the textbook. Oh yeah, it was near the bottom of the page. There was that picture next to it. And maybe you can remember where it was, but you can't remember what it said. Yeah. Okay. But notice you didn't sit there and say, oh, I got to remember where that thing was on the page. You just automatically encoded that. We also automatically process often time or temporal cues. When did something happen? So, well, when did he call? Oh yeah, he called in the afternoon. And once again, you didn't sit down and say, now I've got to memorize that he called in the afternoon. Without any effort, automatically you encoded that information and stored it. The frequency at which something happened, how often it happened as well, we often automatically process. So how many times did he call? Well, let me think. He called 3 times. Yeah, 3 times. And once again, you didn't sit down and say, now I've got to remember that that was 3. No, you just automatically encoded that and stored it. Now, we have learned something about automatic processing versus effortful processing, which we're going to see here. Let's use another example of automatic processing. One of the other things that we often automatically encode and store in memory would be what we had to eat. You can probably tell me if you've eaten something today, you can probably tell me what you had. Now, that, again, you didn't sit down and say, I've got to memorize that. And with effort, you simply automatically encoded and stored that. Now, there's one problem with this. Automatically encoded information often fades rapidly. We are unable to retrieve it. So if I asked you, instead of what did you have earlier today to eat, and ask you, what did you eat 2 weeks ago? You're going to say, well, I don't remember. Yeah, fades rapidly. Now, on the other hand, information that we have encoded and stored through a process of effortful processing tends to produce memories that are more durable and more accessible. So they will be available to our retrieval much longer, and we can bring them to mind much more readily. And take, for example, maybe if you worked so hard to learn all of those terms in that anatomy class, and you put tremendous effort into learning them, we can wake you up later in the middle of the night and you can blurt out those terms even months later. Because of the tremendous effort that you put into learning it, it becomes more durable, more accessible. So we also have learned that the process of rehearsal enables memory as well. So rehearsal being effortful and conscious repetition of information. So one of the first to study this heavily was Hermann Ebbinghaus, as you see in the picture, late 1800s. And so the way he studied rehearsal is he, first of all, devised lists of nonsense syllables, just combinations of letters that didn't mean anything. And he then would take a list of these nonsense syllables and he would rehearse that list some number of times on day one. Then on day two, he would go and he would time how long it took him to relearn that list of nonsense syllables. What do we learn from that? As you can see in the chart, the more times he repeated his list on day one, the less time it took him to relearn the list to where he could again say it perfectly without looking. Okay, so increasing rehearsal also increases the amount of information that is retained. The relearning was a measure of how much information he had retained. Now, the converse is also true. The fewer times that he rehearsed the list on day one, the longer it took him to relearn it. So notice here, less information is retained with less rehearsal. Now, that has some implications. If we have something that we want to learn, the more times that we rehearse it, the better, the more likely we are to be able to retrieve it later. Now, I want you to think about something. You got a list of 10 nonsense syllables, and you're repeating it over and over again, rehearsing it with conscious effort. You suppose sometimes on day one, he could actually repeat that list perfectly after maybe 24 repetitions or 32 or 42? Yes, often he was able to perfectly reproduce that list well before he stopped rehearsing the list. Notice, even so, the additional rehearsal continued to improve his recall on day two. And this is what we call overlearning. That is continuing to rehearse information that we already have learned perfectly. Overlearning improves recall as well. So that has implications if you're studying for a test. I think often what we do is we study until we've got it, And so once you can, define all the terms on your own, you say, I'm done. Well, this suggests that if any time elapses between the time that you have learned that and you take the test, that you will actually benefit from continuing to review those things you already know perfectly. And in fact, overlearning also helps to overcome one of the other problems that people have when they take tests. It helps to overcome test anxiety. So if you've done a good bit of overlearning, then you will be able to still remember those terms even if you get somewhat keyed up and nervous about the test. Now, how much overlearning? It turns out that even a little overlearning gives you a great deal of benefit. They found out that 50% overlearning can triple the amount of information that you remember 3 or 4 days later. So what's that mean? 50% overlearning? Well, if it took you an hour to learn something perfectly, then that means what? Rehearsing it half as long again, so an extra half an hour will actually, as much as triple what you remember 3 or 4 days later. This is also very important for things that you have to remember that you're not going to have a chance to review them, or you might have to recall it without any opportunity for review. So think of maybe skills that you have to reproduce unexpectedly under certain circumstances. So use overlearning to improve your performance. Okay, here are a number of well-documented memory effects that have been shown through much research. One is the spacing effect. Spacing effect means that you are spacing out your rehearsal over an extended period of time rather than engaging in mass practice, in other words, cramming. So, for example, which approach is going to give you better results on the test? Studying for 3 hours straight through the night before the test? Or what about the same amount of time, 6 half-hour sessions spread over 6 days before taking the test? Well, spreading them out over 6 days, the same amount of time will give you better results. Time and time again in experiments, this has been the result. Now, we're assuming that you do review all of the material each time that you sit down to do it. But if you do, you're going to get better practice. And that kind of makes sense. You might think about a similar example. Suppose you want to get good at basketball free throws. How are you going to get better? Will you do better if you just practice for 3 hours on Saturday afternoon every week? Or will you do better if you spend a few minutes every day, day in, day out, over several weeks? And of course, everybody knows, spend a little time every day, it's going to do more for you. Last example of this, so you want to run a marathon. Okay, what's better, space practice or mass practice? Of course, everybody knows, yeah, the way you train for a marathon is not you go out, you don't do anything till the day before, and then you spend, go and you run 20 miles the day before the marathon. That's not going to work very well. What do? You run a few miles a day for weeks before, and then you're going to be able to do well. So same thing with memory, spacing out your rehearsal practice of that information, much better. Okay, so use that in, again, how you study. It means that you may have to spend some time planning ahead, but you'll do better. The next one is the testing effect. And they found that when people were tested on information and then retested, they did better than if they were just exposed to that information and then given a test. Okay, so testing them and retesting, again, even if they didn't review the information in between, did better. So I think, again, this is very important for students because often the way they study for tests is just rereading information. Well, it turns out what would be better is if you were to constantly test yourself on that information. So things like what? Using flashcards where you have to actually produce the answer yourself, having other people quiz you on that information, or sitting down and seeing if you can actually write out the explanation of the terms on your own. That self-testing will actually give you better results than if you just reread information. Not much happens memory-wise if you're just rereading stuff. Okay, testing effect. Then number 3, I don't know what's wrong with our numbers here. The serial position effect. Now that's illustrated here on this chart. So what they did is they had people given a list of words, and then they were asked to recall the words. And what they found, if the people were asked to immediately recall that list of words, they remembered the last words on the list best. And that's actually a part of this serial position effect that we call the recency effect. They remembered the most recent words best. Second best, they remembered the first words on the list, the very beginning of the list. But notice what happened to the words in the middle of the list. They didn't remember those very well at all. Now, if the subjects were then read a list of words and then they were asked to recall them later rather than immediately, what you see is they then only remembered the things that were near the beginning of the list, and the middle and the end of the list not remembered well. So over time, the recency effect drops off until we have just the primacy effect. So that's the serial position effect. Now, one of my students actually came up with an idea of how they might use this to study better. He said, when you study things repeatedly, like we were talking about with space practice, if you do it all in the same order every time, you're going to remember what? The things that you studied first best, and if any time goes by, the middle and the end, not so much. So they said what we ought to do is we ought to rotate the information that we're reviewing. And maybe so on day one, we review chapter one, day two, or we review chapter one first, and then two and three. Maybe on day two, we start with chapter two, and then 3-1. And then maybe day three, start with chapter three, and then 1-2. So we're rotating the information so each of it gets reviewed first. That's an interesting concept. I haven't seen research on it, but it's consistent. The idea is consistent with this. Okay, now, what types of information can we encode? What types of information can we get into our nervous system? We can get images as well as sounds. So this is what we call visual or acoustic encoding. We also can encode meaning. So we can bring into our nervous system semantic encoding. In other words, storing or encoding the meaning of information. We also can encode information by its structure and how it's organized. So how it's organized may be encoded. Okay, now, what was that sentence that I asked you to remember? Okay, give me a few seconds. Try to say it. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Did you come up with any part of the sentence? When we do this in a face-to-face class, we often get several variations of the sentence. Most people remember something about a rioter, angry, sometimes remembered, threw a rock, often is remembered, but then it gets a little fuzzy. Would it be at the window? The angry rider threw a rock at the window, or would it be angry rider threw a rock through the window? And we often get a division of ideas. This illustrates the encoding, how we actually imagine things. So often those who remember it being threw a rock through the window will say, well, I remembered it that way because I pictured the rock going towards the window. And of course, you know, if it hit the window, well, obviously it would go through it, right? And so they will remember it as they encoded it, as they pictured it or imagined it. The reality was it was actually threw a rock at the window, okay? So don't feel bad if you thought that as well. Notice also that the last part of that sentence was the part that people tended to have trouble with. Yes, and after a time, the recency effect drops off, and the things in the middle of the sentence and end of the sentence were less and less well remembered, just like the serial position effect predicts. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about encoding the meaning associated with information, semantic encoding. How do we do this? Well, we associate new information with old information that we have stored. And so when we store the meaning as well as visual or sound information, we tend to remember things better. So we tend to remember things better if we have a meaningful encounter with someone than if we just see an image of them or if we just hear their name. Yeah, if we have that meaningful encounter, we're going to remember about them more readily. Okay, meaningful information then is easier to encode and retrieve. Okay, so now, what was that list of words that I asked you to remember? I want you to take your pen and paper or pencil and paper and write down as many of those words as you can remember. I'll give you about 15 seconds to write down as many as you can. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Well, what words did you remember? Again, we don't have a class here, but I can tell you what typically happens, and maybe you'll find this is consistent. Students will tend to remember the word cigarette. They'll tend to remember typewriter, and then it starts getting fuzzy. Sometimes people will remember fire, but not as often as cigarette or typewriter. Okay. Now, what are the other words that are often not remembered? The word void, inherent, and processed. So why are the words process, inherent, and void harder to remember than typewriter, cigarette, and fire? Well, often students will say it's because, I can mentally picture typewriter, cigarette, or fire, but I can't picture void or inherent or process. It's hard to form that mental picture. So this is an example of how visual encoding can aid memory. Now, I'll add one other thing. The least often remembered word is inherent. And I think there's a good reason for that. Not only is it hard to picture, but also if you don't know what inherent means, it's probably the word that the fewest people actually know. If you don't know what the word means, it becomes, again, harder to remember. Okay. So, and by the way, when I was an undergraduate student, I probably didn't know the meaning of the word inherent either. It took me a few years of college before I got that one. So don't feel bad if it's a new one to you. Okay. So here we have an illustration of how combining visual encoding with meaning, with semantic encoding, actually produces a very powerful aid to memory. So here we have two women, and you'll notice the woman on the left looks older. Now, in reality, these two women are identical twins, exactly genetically the same. Why does the woman on the left look older? Well, it turns out that she went into excessive use of those tanning machines, tremendous amount of sun exposure also, and she smoked a lot. And that caused her skin to age more rapidly than her twin sister. Now, you will remember that better, given that you have connected that with these vivid images, than if I just told you, oh, too much sun exposure and cigarette smoking is going to age your skin. You won't remember that as well as you remember it if I put the pictures there with it. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? The next thing we want to look at, aids to memory, would be what we call mnemonics. I know it's a weird word, right? It has an M at the beginning. That's weird. Anyway, mnemonics, these are memory strategies. Okay, you might call them sort of memory tricks that help aid memory. Often these mnemonics then will utilize vivid imagery as well as organizing information to aid memory. For example, you've got the method of loci. I'll skip over the peg word system. You can look into that one yourself if you're interested. The method of loci is a memory aid in which you have some place that you can mentally picture. You might have, for example, the layout of your house. So you can mentally walk through the various rooms in your house, entering from the front door, the living room, into the kitchen, dining room, bedroom, so forth, whatever rooms you have there. So then what you can do is you can associate each item that you have on a list of things that you need to remember with various places in the house. So you can mentally put that gallon of milk that you need to remember in the entranceway of your house mentally. And maybe then that bag of dog food that you need to get in the kitchen, and maybe um, that jar of mayonnaise that you need to get. Maybe you can imagine that being in the living room and you're smearing that mayonnaise on the TV screen. What? Yeah, actually, they say the goofier these mental images are that you dream up, the more readily you'll actually remember it. So then when it comes time to remember the things on your list and you're at the grocery store, then you mentally walk through your house and it will help you recall each of those things. So I've tried this and it works pretty well. Now, I think these strategies work partly because, yes, they organize the information, in this case, organizing it into rooms in your house. Also because they use imagery. I think there's a third factor that comes into play. When you use these techniques, you also spend more time thinking about the things that you need to remember. And I think that also adds to their effectiveness. So anyways, if you want to improve your ability to remember lists without writing them down and bringing your paper along, then you might try these mnemonics like that. Now, we can aid memory then and improve the encoding of information by organizing it into either chunking or hierarchies. So let's look at each of those. So here we have, okay, number one. Have a look at that. So if I asked you to look at that for a few moments, and then tomorrow I ask you to reproduce those symbols that you saw on line one, how well do you suppose you'd do? Well, none of us would do well, okay? Um, why not? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is that, well, they're sort of meaningless symbols to us. They're not symbols that are familiar. And so, lacking meaning, they're going to be difficult to remember. The other thing is there's just no organization to it, right? So, we could actually then have a look at number two. Suppose I show you number two, and I say, okay, tomorrow I'll ask you what number two is. Okay, so I show it to you for a moment. Tomorrow I ask you to repeat those, that series of letters. Will you remember them well? No, you're going to have difficulty with that. Okay. Now, why? Well, because they're just random letters. It doesn't spell any meaningful word, right? It lacks meaning and it lacks organization. How could you make it easier to remember each of the letters on this list? What you could do is you could rearrange those letters into a word, such as this word we have down here on number 4, nickels, right? So notice that organizing information into meaningful units is known as chunking. Here it is back here, chunking, okay? Organizing into meaningful units. So nickels is more meaningful and therefore easier to remember than that random letters. Still contains the same letters, easier to remember. And we could carry that steps further. Here we have, how about number 3? It looks like some weird language, right? That would be very difficult to remember, yes? However, if we again took each of these and realign those letters into words, and then organize those then into actual meaningful phrases, then we would more readily remember them. So chunking, the higher the level of meaning that we can place with those things, the better. Here's another example of chunking. How about that? What if I ask you to remember this list of numbers? That's going to be pretty hard, right? Although, do you see a pattern? Some of you that are real, yeah, there we go. Look at that. It looks like years: 1776, 1492, 1812, 1941. Okay, so now we've got some years. Now it still might be hard to remember unless you recognize that, oh, these could be associated with dates in history. Like 1776 would be what? American Constitution. 1492, Columbus. I don't know why they always had Columbus. It was always, there was people here already. But anyway, yeah. 1812. Oh, we had a war with somebody. Who was that? I don't remember. But I remember there was a war of 1812. In 1941, Pearl Harbor. Yeah, World War II. So if you know your history and you've detected this pattern, you can readily now remember that whole sequence of numbers here. What is that? 16 numbers perfectly and in the correct order. Notice how chunking can be really useful. Acronyms are another type of chunking. So if you have to remember the colors of the visual spectrum or the rainbow in the correct order, you can learn the name Roy G. Biv. Not a real person as far as I know, but if you take each of those letters, represents one of the colors, red, orange, yellow, and so forth. Once you got that, it's easy to remember. Notice you're organizing it into meaningful chunks again. We can also use hierarchies to organize information into categories and subcategories. So let's say you're studying minerals, then you can organize them mentally into various types of stones and the sub categories of precious or masonry stones, and then the category of metals, which include rare, common, or alloys in terms of metals, and then specific types of metals beneath each of those. So what this does is this sort of stores that information sort of in separate mental drawers, if you will. So when you need that information, then you can mentally go to that drawer, open it, and there's your information. You could also do that with what we've just been studying here. So you could take the process of encoding and you could break that down into the categories of encoding things by meaning, encoding things by imagery, or encoding things on the basis of organization, which could include using chunking or putting together hierarchies. So that particular organization can help you remember. Now, when you are reading a textbook, where do you run into hierarchies that might help you actually remember the information you're reading about? Well, if you've noticed, if you're very observant, you might have noticed at the beginning of each chapter, there's a table of contents. Now, when I was a student, I'd blow right past that. I don't think I really even knew it was there. It's just invisible to me. But it turns out that that is actually a hierarchy that can help you mentally organize the information you're going to read about. So if you read that table of contents, then it puts a structure for that information that you'll then be learning, and it helps you then to organize it mentally. So I actually advise students, yeah, read that table of contents before you read the chapter in the textbook. It will help you. All right. Next, we're going to look at then the storage of information. We just talked a lot about encoding and getting the information into our nervous system. The next step must be then storing the information, retaining it for later retrieval. So storage is at the heart of our memory processes. They have identified 3 stores of memories, as we noted earlier: sensory memory, working memory, long-term memory. And generally speaking, information will pass through each of those by being encoded into each of them if it is to be stored long-term, and then later on can be retrieved. So notice, again, we have a sequential process. So let's look at each of those types of memory then. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, illustrate something about sensory memory to you. Okay, I'm going to flash something on the screen, and this is going to illustrate sensory memory. What I want you to do is I want you to primarily observe how long is the information on the screen before it fades away. Okay, so it will be there just for a short period of time. Notice how long does that image still remain visible before it fades out. Oops, you go to the next one, sorry. One more, sensory memory, yeah, okay. All right, so how long could you still see those letters? Yeah, what they found is that it takes about a half of a second for those things that enter sensory memory to fade away if we don't attend to them. Okay, so this was studied by Sperling. Now, what people thought years ago was that the stuff that you see in sensory memory, that enters sensory memory, that really not everything in your visual field even got into sensory memory. That was the viewpoint. There was a researcher named Sperling, though, that had a different idea. And his idea was that, well, actually, all that information gets into sensory memory, but you're exposed to it for such a short time, it fades away so quickly that you can't rehearse all of those items. You can't mentally say them to yourself. And so many of them have faded away before you've actually had a chance to rehearse them. And so he set out to test this. And the way he did this is he would flash a similar image on the screen with, 9 letters here for 50 milliseconds, 20th of a second or so. And then he'd have people try to remember the letters. And then just averaging out over many people how many letters were correctly remembered, it turned out that the recall on this was about 44%. Okay. So, yeah, people didn't remember all the letters they saw, just some of them. So, what he next did is he trained his subjects to recognize 3 musical tones, one a high-pitched tone, one medium, and one low-pitched tone. These tones were then to indicate which line of letters the person was to remember. Okay, if it was the low tone, it would be the top line. If it was the high tone, the bottom line, and so forth. So then what he would do is he would project the letters on the screen again for 50 milliseconds and darken it, of course, at the end of 50 milliseconds, very brief, and then immediately sound one of the tones, indicating which line to be remembered. And what he found is when he did that, people, as he averaged it out, 100% perfect recall, okay? They would remember it correctly when cued by which line to remember. Didn't matter whether it was low, high, or medium, they would remember it perfectly. So what he then concluded, and what we have since then affirmed, is that indeed all of that information was getting in there in sensory memory. It was just you had to rehearse some of it, and whatever you were looking for, you might be able to rehearse that long enough to hold on to it while the rest of it faded away. Because if asked what were on the other lines, people's recall was not very good. Okay, lines that they had not associated with the tone. Now, what this also indicated is visual sensory memory is really a brief photographic memory. So, I always have students that say, hey, what about people? I've heard people that have photographic memory. What about that? And I had to tell them, you know what? Everybody has photographic memory. Now, the only thing is, it only lasts about a half a second. Yeah. So at least normally, there are people who are different, a few of them, that where it might be somewhat longer. But for the majority of us, we have brief photographic memory. All that stuff is getting in there in sensory memory. By the way, this is also further demonstrated as they did the similar type of experiment, but they introduced a time delay between flashing the letters on the screen and producing the tone. And as the delay got longer, the accuracy in remembering the letters decreased. So again, those letters were fading from sensory memory as that delay was occurring. Okay, so that's sensory memory. How long does sensory memory last? Well, for vision, about half a second. For sounds, about 3 to 4 seconds. Now, textbook says for touch, less than a second. So let us look next at the concept of working memory. And you will find that we can sort of use the term working memory and short-term memory interchangeably. I'll talk about what the slight difference is between the two in just a moment. So first of all, let's consider the capacity of short-term memory. How much information can we hold in short-term memory? This is something that was studied by George Miller, and I think let's start out with a demonstration that can help you understand what the capacity of that short-term memory is. So get a pencil and piece of paper if you don't have one, get it ready. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a list of words in a moment. And so I want you to listen to the list. Don't write them down until after I finish reading the list. And then I'll say, go ahead and write them down. And after I say write them down, you write down as many of the words as you remember. Okay. All right. So are you ready? Go ahead and pause the video if you need to go get a pencil and paper if you don't have it handy. And once you've got it, come back and start it, and I'll give you the list. So here is the list. Listen first, then write. Night, doze, nap, awake, nightmare, pajamas, alarm, drowsy, dream. Write them down. Okay. If you haven't quite finished writing them down, pause the video and finish writing, and then come back. All right, so you've got your words written down. I'm going to now read the list to you again. I want you to check off how many of the words you got correct. So here we go. Here's the list, how it actually was. Night, doze, nap, awake, nightmare, pajamas, alarm, drowsy, and dream. Count up how many of those words you actually wrote down. Okay. All right, if you didn't quite get them all as I reread the list, just pause the video, back it up a little, and catch it again. Okay, so how many words did you get correct? I'm going to bet that you probably got at least 5, and you may have got as many as 9, although it would be rather unusual if you actually got all 10, unless you cheated. So what you will find is that this is consistent with what George Miller found in his experiments. He found that people could remember somewhere between 5 to 9 numbers or letters, and he published the results of his research back in 1956, way back when, with a paper entitled "The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2, Limits on Capacity for Processing Information." And in that research, he had found that participants in his research were able to recall 7 plus or minus 2 letters from somewhere between 5 and 9. And when we do this with an entire class, it's very interesting because what we'll find is the greatest number of students will have remembered somewhere between 6, 7, or 8 letters, or 6, 7, or 8 words from that list that I gave you. There will be a few who only remember 5, and there will be a few who go as high as 9. Occasionally there is a person or two in the class that actually remembered all 10. And when we ask them, well, how did you remember it? Often they will say, well, I organized the words mentally into categories, which is actually a type of the hierarchy sort of thing that we had later. So they actually used one of those mnemonics to actually go beyond what is typical. So this is very typical. I will say that for other types of information other than letters, words, and so on, more complex information, the capacity may be somewhat less. Now, this also points up a phenomenon you might have noticed. So let's say that at some moment you have, let's say, 7 short-term memory slots available, and all 7 of them are filled with information. Now, some new information comes into your short-term memory. What is going to happen with some of that information that is currently there? In order for the new information to come in, something is going to have to leave. It's going to be displaced by the new information. Now, if that information is not then encoded into long-term memory, it simply is lost as the new information displaces it. So that may account for if you have too many events going on at one time, too many things coming at you rapidly, you might forget something that you actually had encountered as it was displaced by new information before you could encode it to long-term memory. Now, we can increase the functional capacity of short-term memory or working memory by using chunking. For example, remembering this list of letters with a number in there, we could chunk that into FBI, LOL, CIA, F4WD, four-wheel drive, let's call it. You could remember those 4 chunks and keep those in your working or short-term memory, and thereby actually expand it to 12 bits of information. So there are some tricks you can do to expand its capacity. Now, how long does information stay in short-term or working memory? One answer to that question is as long as we continue to keep rehearsing it over and over again. So yes, if we have, say, a phone number that we're holding in short-term memory, and we're constantly rehearsing that, repeating it over and over to ourselves, we don't forget it until we stop rehearsing it. That said, when we stop rehearsing it, there's a good chance we won't remember it later. It won't make it into long-term memory many times. Okay, so that's one answer, as long as we keep rehearsing it constantly. But what if we don't rehearse it constantly? That's what Peterson studied back in 1959 with an experiment that they did in order to measure the duration of information in short-term memory. So they showed people letters like you saw before, and then the person was distracted by having to subtract numbers mentally. So the math task was to keep them from rehearsing those letters that they had seen on the screen. What they found is that the recollection of those letters that the person saw faded rapidly when they were distracted, when they were unable to constantly rehearse that information, to the point where 18 to 20 seconds later, they virtually remembered none of it. Okay, so stuff fades pretty quickly from working short-term memory, not as quickly as from sensory memory, but quickly nonetheless. This might also explain why, if you are holding some information in mind and then you are distracted, that again, you may not remember that information later. The distraction comes along, that information fades from short-term memory. If you haven't encoded it in a long-term memory, it is essentially gone. Okay, so distractions can interfere with memory. All right, now we've been using the term working memory, short-term memory kind of interchangeably, and they're really kind of similar concept. Working memory is kind of an expansion of the idea of short-term memory. So working memory adds to this that we are processing information that we are holding in short-term memory. So the processing of it, working with that information while we're actually holding it. Okay. Now, what kinds of things can we have in working memory? We can have auditory or verbal information. For example, we might be looping the numbers of a phone number, phonological loop as they call it, where we keep repeating that phrase over and over to ourselves, and we can hold it there in working memory. Or we can do the same with visual spatial information. Not only can we hold that information, but we can work with it in what they sometimes call our visual spatial sketch pad. So we're mentally thinking about that living room and how we're going to move the furniture around and rearrange that furniture. We can mentally do this while holding all of it in mind. We also can have in our working memory information that we've retrieved from long-term memory, memories, things that we've encountered in information we encountered before. So working memory then is our conscious, active, current processing of information, if you will. That then brings us finally to long-term memory. So what about the duration of long-term memory? Well, let's look at the capacity first. I'm sorry, there's a lot of distractions this afternoon. The capacity, essentially unlimited. Now, they've tried to estimate how many trillion bits of information a human can store in long-term memory, but for all practical purposes, our long-term memory is never full. It seems that we can always add more to it. So essentially unlimited. Now, if you have a hard time believing this, have a look at this Clark's nutcracker, this bird here in the picture. This bird can remember where it stored 6,000 catches of pine seeds that it has buried. Remembers where they are. And I found out, interestingly, found this out about a year ago, that the bird also remembers the order in which they were stored and will retrieve them in the order that it put them away. Isn't that amazing? So if that bird with the brain maybe a size of a pea can remember that, imagine the capacity of the human memory system. Staggering. So we're going to leave it at that. Oh, duration of long-term memory. Sorry, one more thing. So how long can information stay in long-term memory? Anywhere from things that have happened a few minutes ago to potentially a lifetime. Yes, people may remember things even in very old age that happened when they were very young. So these memories are very durable once stored in long-term memory. Okay, well that does it for today. Sorry about the distractions. And so we'll pick up the middle portion of the chapter in the next video. Thank you for your patience and have a great day.